Hi, Michael.
Hello, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
Good.
Trying to maintain sanity in the face of all that seems to be happening, which gets
you're the person we count on for that. You're the person we count on for that. That's why I've called you here.
Okay. I don't know if I guess I should feel complimented by that, but I feel like there could be a subtle dig somewhere in there. But that's all right.
I have no comment. Let me just introduce us.
Okay.
I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. Amazing as that may seem. You're Michael Tracey. I don't know how you identify yourself. I mean, is it like independent journalist who was known as a Russiagate skeptic and spent months after the Mueller report doing victory laps? Is that what your business card says?
Yeah, I had to get my business card enlarged to encompass all that.
For all the laps.
Right.
There's like a GIF of the laps. It's a digital business card.
Yes. But independent journalist works. I mean, I write for a variety of publications, but I maintain independence in terms of my basic affiliation, which is ultimately to myself and I guess in a way to my readers, which is nice.
That is nice. You got a Patreon. People should go to your Patreon and give you money, right?
If they want, they can give money in other respects. I have a PayPal, but let's not do a whole solicitation yet. I mean, they should at least wait and see if I make any sense.
We should find out what exactly they get for their money. So let's get into that. So you now, having been a Russiagate skeptic, are a Ukrainegate skeptic. Well, you're an impeachment skeptic. And I would just say out of the gate, I was largely on your wavelength on Russiagate. I didn't go maybe as far as you did, but I was, saying all along, look, we haven't seen a smoking gun. We may never see one, whether that means there wasn't collusion or this gun never appears. It's a mistake. I felt it was a strategic mistake to get as amped up as everyone was getting about it. And it annoyed me how a lot of the evidence was being kind of overread and the kind of sometimes McCarthyite overtones of the Russophobia, all that bothered me, not as much as it bothered you. But I got to say, in this case, this time, the only thing I'm worried about is the political wisdom of impeachment. I think impeachment it seems to me, I mean, we'll know more as the investigation proceeds, but I think the impeachment itself is probably legit. So I think I view what we can pretty safely say Trump has done a little more gravely than you do. So why don't you tell us why you don't think it's grave? And we can set aside for now the question of whether impeachment is politically wise. I suspect we both have concerns about that.
Well, I think it's appropriate that in your lead-in, you went through very briefly the history of all that transpired by way of the Trump-Russia saga. And saga is a charitable term to describe all that, because what I think it does is that provides sort of the contextual foundation or the foundational context for what we're now in the midst of in terms of Ukraine. It's not an accident that this phone call that Trump had was with the Ukrainian president. It's not as though that this would have had such an immediate and somewhat frenzied impact if Trump were on the phone appearing to solicit assistance from the president of Angola or something, right? Ukraine has a very specific meaning given all that preceded it with Mueller. In fact, the initial ask that Trump makes to the Ukrainian president has not to do with Joe Biden. It's related to the investigation that was underway with Bill Barr, the Attorney General, into the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation, which the findings of which have not been publicized yet. So
the findings of which thing? Of
the investigation undertaken by the Justice Department under the helm of Bill Barr into the origins of the Russia investigation. And then there's a separate but related issue having to do with FISA abuse. None of that has been revealed yet, but that seems to have been, I mean, it's a little bit pathetic that you have to kind of have this like vague interpretive lens when you're trying to understand what the heck Trump is trying to communicate, because it's very garbled most of the time. But it seems like what he initially brought up in that phone call related to the U.S. investigation into the origins of
and just parenthetically, I don't know this territory, but a number of people are saying that Trump is indicating there that he's buying into a particular kind of crackpot conspiracy theory about, in fact, the DNC emails not having been hacked by Russia, but by somebody else, and there's some server in Ukraine that will. That's my understanding, although I don't understand it clearly. Is that do you have a take on this?
I think it's muddled what exactly he was referring to. I think perhaps what he meant, and again, you shouldn't have to say perhaps what he meant when you're analyzing on an official presidential phone call transcript. That's just the nature of Trump's,
right.
Let's say suboptimal communication style. I think he was basically referring to this countervailing narrative of Ukrainian collusion or Ukrainian interference as having been the real interference in the 2016 election as opposed to Russia. And so he was just kind of throwing out terms that might be brought like vaguely aligned with that thesis, such as crowd strikes, such as server. It doesn't really make that much logical sense, but I think that's what he was getting at.
Okay.
And aside from how he might characterize it, which is obviously dubious, there is something to it in the sense that there was some quote unquote Ukrainian interference, if you want to use that term, in 2016. So I don't think it's entirely without merit to want to understand the full scope of it.
What was the nature of the Ukrainian interference there was?
Well, the Ukrainian parliamentarian Lyshenko, who is now at the center of this episode and who has, is now in public feud with Rudy Giuliani, he is understood to have been part of the provision of the so-called Black Ledger in 2016 that had to do with Paul Manafort and his business dealings. And actually a court in Ukraine later ruled that the release of that ledger constituted, in their words, interference in a foreign election. And the provenance of that ledger is dubious. You can't, whether the signature that was purported to be from Manafort later could not be verified by a Ukrainian body, et cetera. So, we don't have to really get this entire history, but there's perhaps a nugget of truth to the notion that there was at least some kind of Ukrainian influence. How illicit it was or how illegal it was, separate issue. But in terms of trying to glean what exactly Trump was trying to relay, there's something potentially there.
But your view is that if this whole thing didn't have these various kinds of connections to Russiagate, to the Mueller investigation, narrative connections, you think it would not have. Because it would not.
Well, let me just explain that point, because the reason why I made the analogy, theoretically, if this same conversation had taken place with pick a random country somewhere else in the world,
let me give you the thought experiment. Suppose it was arms sales to Taiwan. Let's do apples to apples. In other words, a great power that we are gravely suspicious of, or at least the national security establishment is gravely suspicious of. Let's say it was arms sales to Taiwan. Trump was holding them up because he wanted the Taiwanese government to investigate Joe Biden. I think that would have gotten pretty much the same reaction this got.
Maybe it would have, but I think that there are so many additional connotations in the case specifically of Ukraine that it's actually central to contextualizing why this gained such overnight traction, where now we're in this brand new phase of American politics and we're entering impeachment mode for, I don't know, months, a year, who knows how long. And the reason why I assert that there is such stark narrative continuity is, again, because Trump even brought up Robert Mueller himself in the phone call. So there's even a literal connection in that way. But on top of that, you have Democrats such as Adam Schiff, who's going to be leading a plank of the impeachment inquiry, emphasizing that Trump withheld military aid, and Schiff is not objecting to that so much on its own right, but saying that he withheld military aid which was needed to fend off Russian aggression. That's how he puts it. And the connotations also harken back to all the kind of the prevailing thematic points that were operative in the Russia investigation, such as accepting foreign assistance, which automatically got cast as inherently either wrong or evil or maybe even illegal, all of which was, I think, up for contestation all throughout. You had this, I think that it has such resonance because Trump was accused of collusion for 2.5 years. And now you have an episode that could be portrayed as, an open and shut case of, quote, collusion. So it kind of enlivens and revives everything that preceded it that maybe didn't end with as explosive or conclusive of a culmination as some people would have hoped. And now this provides that conclusion or the culmination. And I think, in light of all that went so horrifically wrong with the Mueller investigation, at least in my view, it justifies at minimum some forbearance, or at least not an automatic rush to the most consequential possible remedy, which is impeachment, which is going to consume the nation for a long time. I just don't think that the track record on the part of the people who are really going to the mat here is all that good in the very recent history. So therefore, at least in my mind, my instinct is to maintain something of a critical distance from it. Not that I want to excuse the Trump conduct. I think it was sleazy on his part, probably corrupt, but doing sleazily corrupt things is a habit of Trump that we see exhibited on a daily basis.
It's a habit, but we don't exonerate a criminal by saying, don't worry, he kills people all the time, he robs banks all the time, it's no big deal. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me to say this is classically Trump, so it doesn't mean. I'd say it's the opposite. If it's a pattern of conduct, that's all the more reason to impeach him.
No, but it's not an exoneration to question whether it warrants impeachment. I mean, there are many other things that I would convict Trump on that have happened over the course of the presidency that I also would then not necessarily say ought to be grounds for impeachment. So there's a distinction there where I don't know that you could be said to be excusing the conduct if you want to at least caution the way in which it's being portrayed as the be-all, end-all of the Trump presidency. Again, in light of how the opposition to Trump, I think, has misinterpreted so much of this evidence. And not to say that this particular piece of evidence couldn't be as bad as it's being made out to be, but I'm saying I just don't think recent history shows that credence has been earned by the people who want to now make this a focal point of their opposition strategy.
It hasn't. And in fact, we're seeing them repeat some of the same annoying sins, which is overstating the evidence. And this is a tactical mistake on Adam Schiff's part. It helps Trump when Adam Schiff says, you asked the Ukrainian president to manufacture dirt. No, he didn't ask him to manufacture dirt. He asked him to do an investigation. Now, I'm sure Trump would be happy if he did manufacture it. And if the Ukrainian president came back and said, hey, we can't find any dirt. Okay, if we manufacture some, Trump would probably say, okay, but the fact is Trump probably believes the dirt is actually there. That's the way he is. I think that's the way his mind works. And the main thing is you're just giving Trump an excuse to fire up his base whenever you say something that is not strictly true. Adam Schiff went to Harvard Law School, and the guy cannot characterize evidence accurately. And he did the same thing with the phone memo.
Right.
I heard him on NPR acting as if Trump says, will you do me a favor? Let's talk about Biden. That's not the sequence. It does become clear that Biden is one of the favors, but you just should leave aside the ethics of it. It is strategically, tactically wise to characterize all the evidence in strictly accurate terms and no more. And they're already screwing up on that.
And that manufacturing dirt talking point is not just being used by Schiff. It's pretty much a party-wide talking point at this point because they take cues from the leadership. Right. A memo probably did go out, literally.
Yeah.
Using that exact phrase. And I think the reason why you're right to wonder whether that will cause a backfiring is because I think just the term manufacturing dirt, implicit within that is the notion that in order to get something that reflects negatively on Biden, you'd have to manufacture it, or that it would never have exist but for Trump seeking to gin it up out of thin air. Where I think, on paper, there's a reason to at least be legitimately critical of the role of Biden, at least insofar as getting his son this lucrative position on the board of a energy firm when the son had no relevant experience in any.
Well, wait, but did Biden get him the job, or
I meant getting him the job in the looser sense of like nepotistic privilege.
Well, I mean, we don't know. I mean, I'm sure the Ukrainian company was hoping to buy access to Biden. Obviously, right. Hunter Biden did not spend his life preparing for this kind of job.
The point is that you don't have to manufacture dirt in order to
Well, you may. There is no big time evident dirt so far that actually implicates Biden himself. And in fact, there's good reason to think that the case against him has been greatly overstated. The case against Biden, the ethical case against Biden, not leave his son out of Biden. I have adult children. Believe me, you can't control them. Biden is not legally or morally. I mean, my kids are great. Don't get me wrong, but just they do what they want to do, and Biden is not legally or morally responsible for what Hunter Biden does.
Well,
the question is,
if you ever become vice president and one of your children,
which I haven't ruled out, by the way, I'm going to announce that at the end of the podcast. Go ahead.
Yeah. If I'm nominated, I will select you as a condition.
That was the good news for you is you're at the top of the ticket.
Right. Actually, I'm not constitutionally eligible yet, so we have to wait a couple years. Anyway, but I think if you're in Biden's position, then although you can't control all the actions of your adult children, it does reflect on you if one of your offspring gets this lucrative position with no relevant experience, $50,000 a month, in a hotbed geopolitical climate. Remember, Hunter Biden got this board membership in the wake of the 2014 Ukrainian coup or revolution, or however exactly you'd like to put it, because the energy firm was seeking to court influence with Western powers, which were, had basically asserted themselves tacitly / overtly in helping at least to facilitate the coup. So the appearance of that, and the point is, you don't have to manufacture dirt to convey why that would at least look a little suspicious to the average American.
It looks suspicious, but I still don't think we've seen the dirt. I mean, my understanding is that the prosecutor that Biden pressured them to fire was not, in fact, investigating Hunter Biden's company at that point, and B, Biden pressured them both in concert with a bunch of European allies and after the pressuring of them had become official U.S. policy through normal channels, national security and so on. So it wasn't Biden freelancing. The prosecutor wasn't in fact investigating the company and so on. But that's my understanding. You're right in that. Aside from these somewhat more abstract optics issues, or at least an appearance of corruption, remember, this is what members of the Obama administration were contemporaneously saying in terms of the appearance. I mean, you can go find reporting that it's a bad.
So it's not right.
Yeah, it's a bad look, and it shouldn't have. And if Biden did have any control over his son, he should have used it to get him to not take that job for sure.
Right. So the point is, when Adam Schiff is going around saying that dirt was manufactured, already I think you have to step back and say, if that aspect of this is being dubiously portrayed or maybe overblown or exaggerated as a central facet of the Democratic Party's messaging strategy, then I have to at least wonder about other aspects of this, one of which is that the whistleblower complaint, as the New York Times reported to much controversy, originated with what seems to be high-level CIA officer. And I say high level not because we know the person's identity, but because they at least seem to have had direct access to the White House, which would, I would think, suggest some level of high level. Well,
it's apparently somebody
position.
It's apparently somebody who had been stationed at the White House earlier, and therefore had ongoing had easy connection to people who were still at the White House.
Right. So somebody with with access to White House officials, a powerful people probably within the grand scope of the U.S. federal government, I think. And so I'd like to know a little bit more about who that individual was. Not that necessarily that their identity would undermine per se what he or she alleged in the complaint, but there has been, since the beginning of the Trump presidency, concerted moves on the part of unelected national security state officials, and I'm not going to call them the deep state because that has all kinds of bogus and often partisan right-wing implications. But look at some of the behavior of these people over the past several years, and you wonder how exactly that move came about. Was it orchestrated with anybody? Do we really want to, again, valorize somebody in a high-level CIA position as the guardian of democracy without knowing what else might have been operative in their thinking or their strategy? Who were the White House officials that they were apparently in communication with? That would be helpful to know. I have a couple of possible theories as to who that might have been, but
I mean, how much does it matter? We have actually, I would say, unusually interesting and in some ways clear evidence, right? I mean, if that isn't it all about what he did and did not say on that phone call and the ancillary activities of people like Rudy Giuliani and what was and wasn't explicitly conveyed to the Ukrainian president? I mean, does it really matter?
Well, I mean, if the one thing, after everything that Trump has done, after everything that's been said and alleged about Trump, if the one thing that actually precipitates his impeachment happens to have been provided by the CIA, or at least a high-ranking CIA official, possibly in concert with others of comparable power and influence, wouldn't you want to know about that? I mean, doesn't that seem like a pertinent fact in terms of analyzing the situation? I think so. Given the recent history of how elements of the security state have maneuvered against Trump to varying degrees of success, I do think that is highly relevant, even if it doesn't have necessarily direct bearing on how you look at something like the transcript, right?
I would say if there's grave wrongdoing, I consider the whistleblowing legitimate, period. I don't really, and that's why, and I'm already think that there's reasonably grave wrongdoing. We'll know more, but there's some evidence of that. Now, I will say the national security state has overreached and been irresponsible in doing things like leaking to undermine Trump. In fact, we're learning that the reason the administration had even gotten, I don't know if it was a habit, but had on previous occasions consigned a phone quasi-transcript memo to that super secret server is because people in the national security establishment were leaking contents from phone calls where there was not grave wrongdoing. There was just like typical Trump buffoonery. And that is overreaching and should be condemned. And that's not legitimate whistleblowing.
And if we're concerned with overreach, again, I think that would at least be cause to remain somewhat skeptical or at least maintain a critical distance before getting so ahead of ourselves that we're launched into this, spaceship of impeachment that's just going to keep going and going and going for the foreseeable future, because once it gets off the ground, you can't really bring it back. And I am wary of how these security state officials who are nameless and faceless have operated, because once we found out who they were in the recent past, it cast their actions into extreme doubt. The most quintessential example, arguably, actually there are several, but one of the most egregious, I think, being Andrew McCabe, who in June of 2017 opened an investigation on Trump that actually
at this point he was director of the FBI. Is that right?
He was interim director. So it was shortly after Comey was fired, that basically was examining whether Trump himself was a national security threat. And if you go and look at what McCabe said in his book, and well, I mean, just give me a second. If you go and look at what McCabe said in his book,
in some sense, he surely is. But anyway,
but
go ahead.
Should that be the purview of the interim FBI director, really, to assess?
That's a totally legit question. Yes,
in terms of how subjective that is and how fraught with political implications that is. Basically, if you look at the rationale that McCabe proffered, and I wrote a column on this at the time when he came out with this for the Daily News, people can go look it up. But what the rationale that McCabe cited essentially was that he felt Trump's foreign policy attitudes or his policy preferences could rise to the level of being a threat national security-wise. And that, I don't know how much more of a blatant example of overreach you can get from these unelected officials. So I'm still cognizant of all that. Okay. And if people now want to pretend like that's ancient history or something, I just don't buy it, especially given what I've tried to lay out in terms of the narrative continuity between this and what proceeded in terms of Mueller. I think without Mueller, you don't get this. There's a direct.
Okay. But I think that's true, but I think it's true in a different sense. Without Mueller, you don't get this. What I think is I don't think it's so much I think the narrative continuity between kind of Russiagate and Ukrainegate is not totally irrelevant, but I think a more important connection in terms of imparting momentum to this latest impeachment move, a more important connection is the sheer frustration that was felt after Mueller, from the point of view of the resistance, failed to deliver. There was a lot of energy, determined, this is our moment, we're going to get Trump out of office, and then they were thwarted. And I think that is a more relevant fact. And I think that's, like Pelosi had been doing what she could to hold back the flood, right? And this just but there was still the pent-up energy, in a way more energetic than ever because of the frustration, and this pushed it over the line. And again, I personally think this evidence is fairly suggestive evidence of significant wrongdoing. I'm not minimizing it, but I do think as a political matter, the main thing is the frustration.
No, you're right in terms of the political factors involved, because even pre-Ukrainegate, if we're now calling it that, or Ukraine phone call, whatever, more than half of the House Democratic caucus had already called for an impeachment inquiry, and Gerald Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, had been undertaking what he at least described as an impeachment investigation since July. And that pertained strictly to Mueller. Maybe not strictly to Mueller, but Mueller was the thrust of it. And in court filings, et cetera, the prospect of impeachment was explicitly referenced. What changed after the Ukraine phone call was that Pelosi countenanced it on behalf of the entire caucus, essentially. And now I think you only have a handful of Democrats who are not firmly on board. But in terms of the political aspect, yeah, I mean, I went to a town hall meeting from my hometown representative in New Jersey. I don't live in the district now, but that district was Republican my entire life, literally since before I was born. And in 2018, it went to a Democrat. This is the 11th district in New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, who was one of the national security ladies or whatever, like gets get this touted as this a secondary squad or something, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post the day before Pelosi announced the impeachment inquiry, basically saying that they now believe that there was time to do this, blah, blah, blah. But when I went to the town hall meeting in August, this is in, around in the Montclair, New Jersey area. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's, an affluent area with people who maybe have a little bit too much time to watch cable news, frankly. They flooded these town hall meetings all throughout the summer. And I was at one where Mikey Sherrill actually got booed and hissed and jeered by constituents who felt that she was slow walking the impeachment issue when she was basically neglecting this grave existential urgent matter. And they were talking about Mueller stuff. There was no notion of Ukrainegate yet. So that was the underlying kind of political context which gave rise to this. And I think you're right to point that out. Another irony is Tom Steyer, who now is allegedly running for president. His whole pro-impeachment crusade that was launched in 2017, hey, it paid dividends. It worked. He put a lot of pressure through by giving a lot of money to this group. A lot of members of the House of Representatives were subject to an enormous amount of pressure at their town hall meetings, through constituent relations, etc. And I feel as if that legwork hadn't been done, then you wouldn't have had such a fertile ground for these immediate calls for impeachment that came after the Ukraine phone call episode was revealed. So that's why
I think this is mainly a carryover of political energy. But in any event, we should talk about the merits of the case to the extent that we understand the case so far, because we probably disagree about that. I mean, my view is, and this has nothing to do with my view on the policy of arming Ukraine. As you know, I'm not a big fan of arming countries generally, but the president's duty is to orchestrate relations with other nations in the service of one thing and one thing only, and that's the national interest of the United States. I mean, you could add some embellishment to that, but that's fundamentally what it's about. And I often don't agree with how we're actually doing that. But the point is, there is a process that is ultimately grounded in the Constitution for determining how we think the national interest is best served. Congress has input. The president has certain powers. In this case, the arming of Ukraine was a product of both. It was congressionally passed, signed by Trump, right? And just generically, again, leaving aside the merits of the policy, which I'm not here to defend, it is the job of the president to orchestrate relations with other nations in the service of that and that only. And when you significantly subvert the policy that has been thus arrived at in the interest of your own political gain, that's just a problem. And I think it's a big one. And I think it's pretty clear that that's what he was doing. The Biden thing, and by the way, there are ellipses in that phone memo that may show more clearly how much emphasis he put on Biden, but he put enough in what we've seen for us to safely say that he was asking for two things, and you didn't have to be like a genius president of Ukraine to understand. In fact, you could just be a stand-up comic, and which this president of Ukraine is, and understand that if you want Trump to deliver everything Ukraine would like to have from Trump, including those arms, you really should play ball on both of these issues. That seems pretty clear. And I just think that is a clear betrayal of Trump's constitutional duties, just generically. Leave aside the case. By the way, I would say if he did it domestically, if he said to some governor, I'm going to withhold these federal funds, which I have the power to do, unless you amp up your attorney general's investigation into Joe Biden, I'd be pretty damn exercised about that too. This is just, and I think Trump has just almost inured us to just a baseline level of corruption, not in the conventional sense of personal financial corruption, although, that may enter this yet, who knows? But, he has succeeded in getting us to lower our standards. That's my view.
Well, let me just make a quick point about what you said at the beginning there, which is this whole notion of military aid to Ukraine. Right. I think that because impeachment is a political process, that's the cliche that's being repeated now over and over again to hammer that point home. So which is to say, it's not a strictly legalistic process. It has to take into account a whole gamut of political considerations. I think one political consideration that's worth noting is that the notion of sending lethal arms to Ukraine is now going to become sanctified as this bipartisan consensus view that all right-minded people will have to subscribe to. And I think that is sort of a deleterious political consequence of the way in which this narrative is coalesced. Because have you seen anybody question the wisdom of that kind of military aid over the course of this discussion? I feel that's being drowned out. So that's just an observation.
I don't think the questioning of it is relevant to the impeachment discussion at all. I think this is a generic question about a president subverting policy and subordinating it to personal political interest. I just think it's a generic question. I'm not here to support that policy. And I don't think, let me just say this. I think opponents of impeachment who cast their opposition in terms of opposing that policy are just as confused as supporters of impeachment who cast their support in terms of their support for the policy. The policy is irrelevant.
Well, to the extent that I oppose impeachment, I'm not casting it in those terms. I'm just noting it. I'm just observing the way in which the conventional wisdom around sending lethal arms to Ukraine is sort of crystallized into this untouchable realm of bipartisan consensus as a result of the way in which this narrative is coalesced so quickly.
I agree.
So I think a point about the way that so number one, I don't know that we know for sure yet that aid was officially withheld as a condition, conditioned on Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, providing anything illicit on Biden. It seems like that was just a vague implication. So I think it would be good to know.
The timing is suspicious, you'd agree.
I think, people have laid out a timetable that is at least plausible. But if you're going to impeach the president, I'd like to have a little more detail on that, because the aid was eventually released. So they got the aid. They got the weapons.
Well, it was released after the assurances on the phone from the Ukrainian president, right?
Well, yeah, but again, it's not clear that those assurances, given the vagaries of the phone call, it's not clear cut that the assurances were directly tied to Trump's request.
No, I agree. I would expect Trump to hold out for more, to wait until the president of Ukraine actually delivers. On the other hand, any number of things like Trump could have gotten word. In fact, by the way, I don't know, I haven't figured out the dates, but I was listening to the Daily podcast this morning, New York Times podcast, and I hadn't realized, I guess the Times had just reported this, but the White House found out about, before there was even a whistleblower complaint, the White House found out that this CIA officer was raising questions about this. And so the White House knew long before the whistleblower complaint that they might have a problem. And that could have, and I don't know how the dates match up, but that could have led them to release the aid.
Yeah. And then let me give you another hypothetical just to maybe underscore what I think is some of the ambiguity around these topics. So Trump views immigration restrictionism as part of his electoral appeal, and he wants to solidify the anti-immigrant vote, let's say, to bolster his reelection prospects, correct? So one thing that he tried to do was place pressure on the president of Mexico to stop the immigrant influx through its southern border. And let's say Trump used some kind of aid leverage or some kind of leverage that you could assign a financial value to encourage the president of Mexico to, man up on that border and devote resources to stymieing the flow of immigrants so that they wouldn't eventually come to the U.S. Because Trump perceived that to be in his political interest directly. He thought that it would help his reelection campaign. Now, is that within the normal remit of American foreign policy making, or are we okay with that in the sense that the president has exceptionally wide latitude in the domain of foreign affairs for good or ill? I would argue for ill. I think that Congress should restrict the powers of the president to act unilaterally, but that's the current state of affairs in terms of presidential decision making, and it's not just Trump; it goes back many presidents now. I just think that you have to.
That's a good question,
right? But there are a million other examples I could probably proffer along those lines.
The fact is, and I should certainly concede this: politicians all the time subordinate public policy to their political interests in one sense or another, right?
Right.
It's like, you hear, for example, they'd rather have the issue, right? So Congress people didn't vote in favor of something because they actually wanted to lose the vote so they could complain about whatever. You hear this stuff all the time. It happens all the time. And I would say one big difference is usually it's very hard to get clear evidence. There's a question of, like, first of all, the gravity. And again, it's not that I support this particular policy, but whether you arm a country or not is a big deal. That's a momentous policy. It's not just qualitatively, it's not the kind of policy that I think should be subordinate to political considerations. Although, again, look, would Obama have pledged to amp up troops in Afghanistan during the election if he hadn't thought it politically convenient? I doubt it. So, yeah, it happens a lot. But what I would say is, in the case, you usually don't have good evidence. There are various distinctions I could make, but one is just the level of evidence. If we did find a document where Trump is confiding to aides, I think sending troops to the border is actually bad for us, and it's a waste of money. But the politics are important. Then it wouldn't seem to me quite crazy if Congress launched an investigation into it. But because then the evidence would be there.
So what you're saying there essentially is that the notion of allowing personal political interests to supersede the public interest in the domain of foreign affairs is probably commonplace. But the distinction here just happens to be that we have direct evidence of that in the form of a transcript of a whistleblower complaint.
Well, there's also something about the nature of...
That would mean that this is more widespread than maybe some are being led to believe. The critical difference just being the level of evidence to substantiate the suspicion that the public interest has been subordinated.
It depends on what you mean by this. The generic thing I just described, where politicians are, self-serving and so on, is very, very wide. But if by this, I mean, there's two things about this. Arms sales is a momentous, arms aid is a momentous thing, A. And B, specifically looking for dirt on a political opponent is a particularly kind of seedy, self-serving political activity that is qualitatively different from just wanting the public to applaud your Afghanistan policy, okay? It's just qualitatively different. And what I would ask you, Michael, is how many presidents over the last 100 years do you think would do something like this? I can think of one, maybe Nixon. And in fact, articles of impeachment were drawn up against him for not entirely, for behavior not entirely unlike this. But aside from him, I don't know that I could think of more than maybe one over the last century. I don't know. I mean, seriously, like, how many presidents do you think would do what he seems to have done? Call a foreign leader, say, I want you to look for dirt on my political opponent. Otherwise, what the congressionally mandated aid isn't going to happen. Again, he didn't say that explicitly. That seems to have been the subtext. We'll know more as the investigation proceeds. But just if we accept that, name other presidents you really think would do that?
Well, one example that comes to mind, which maybe isn't directly responsive to your question, but it does occur to me. Do you remember when the impeachment was launched against Bill Clinton and then he bombed Iraq? Am I getting that chronology right?
I remember I remember the phrase "wag the dog" around that time. I forget
the wag the dog episode. The wag the dog episode. I believe it was Iraq. I could be wrong.
I think if you had good evidence there, that would be impeachable in itself. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So the point is, look, if you were to assume that was done for political purposes, whatever the motivation precisely might have been, that could have been impeachable if you had a transcript akin to what is out now that detailed the motivations with specificity. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I'll accept that. I don't know that, I think Trump definitely is an anomalous president in a whole variety of respects. I just don't know that the anomaly that maybe this latest episode represents is the most egregious anomaly that I could identify on his part, where it would justify impeachment. I almost think that there are other impeachable offenses that other presidents have committed that nobody ever went forward with it because it was regarded as the fringe notion. I just went back and looked at what Nancy Pelosi was saying in 2006 when the Democrats won the midterm elections that year. And she was poo-pooing the notion of impeachment as a waste of time when a small but vocal minority of her caucus were saying, hey, we should impeach Bush and maybe Cheney about the manipulation of pre-war intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. That was dismissed as this totally idiotic sideshow by none other than Nancy Pelosi. And again, in terms of the moral calculus, in terms of what political factors they're prioritizing, it just gives me pause when I look at this very, very rapid rush to say that whatever happened in this phone call is, on its face, so egregious to the point that it should initiate this historic and extremely time-consuming and probably tedious process that's going to inflame all manner of partisan energies, probably in not the most constructive manner. So that's why I don't necessarily. I'm not opposed to impeachment per se. I'm opposed to, what I'm pro is maintaining a little bit of critical distance, not automatically getting swept up in what the prevailing narrative is, absent a little bit more information, and I just don't see that posture that I'm trying to explicate there really being reflected in very much of the media, much less. I mean, forget the Democrats at this point; they're all on board. So that was that's my advocacy
too. The media too. You're right. I mean, you look at the New York Times reporting; these are straight news stories that characterize that memo as if Trump said, "I want you to do me a favor. Let's talk about Joe Biden." That's the impression you would get from reading that, and it was definitely more complicated than that. Now, again, I think a careful reading indicates that he did mean Biden to be, included in as one of two favors he was asking for. But it's just, if nothing else, a tactical mistake to misleadingly oversimplify evidence because it just plays into Trump's hands, and it is the media and it is the Democrats. I absolutely agree. And I don't think they're going to stop.
I'm like you sort of obliquely referenced this before, but I'm sort of curious what your tactical or strategic misgivings would be for launching an impeachment inquiry, especially now in the midst of a presidential election cycle. Do you think the burden for impeachment advocates ought to be higher given the timing now, given how if the House were to impeach, about 8 presidential candidates would then become jurors? And their time would at least in part be consumed by presiding over this matter, and they would be off the campaign trail, presumably. I mean,
I haven't thought about that. Yeah. I mean, thanks for the opportunity to plug my newsletter, the Non-Zero newsletter, NONZERO. You Google it. It's on the Substack platform, and you can subscribe to it for free. I outlined in the most recent issue, which came out a couple of days ago, the nature of my main concerns, and they're not so much that. I mean, they're mainly the standard ones. One is that, look, at this point, the tribal lines are so sharply drawn. You're not going to move a lot of opinion from one side to the other. You're just going to fire up Trump's base and increase turnout for him. That's one kind of concern. And so far, that's why I'm so annoyed that the Democrats and the media are playing into his hands by reinforcing his unfair persecution narrative. They're doing it. And so that's I would say
that's what drives me crazy. There's no circumspection at all. There's no acknowledgement of what you and I both agree, maybe to varying levels, were some journalistic and broader media failures or mishaps that have characterized much of the Trump presidency. There seems to be no awareness of that or interest in modifying behavior in light of it. And that's what just continues to be what I find maddening about how these narratives so quickly coalesce. It's as if the Mueller issue never happened. It's as if 1,000 other stories that were proven later to be overblown never happened. And I just don't see any difference in behavior collectively.
It's all about the incentive structure. It's like, If you want Twitter followers and you're already kind of part of the resistance, the way to do it is overstate things and oversimplify things. If Adam Schiff wants applause on Twitter and votes, the way to do it is to exaggerate and oversimplify. If the New York Times, whose business model has shifted into to some extent being part of the resistance, I think, if the New York Times wants, the page views and whatever, and more than that, the subscriptions, because it wants kind of heartfelt commitment to its mission, it's in the New York Times' interest to oversimplify this. So it's all about the incentives and people not thinking about not only the long-term interests of the country, and another concern of mine is just a deepening of the polarization through impeachment, but the long-term interests of their own supposed cause of getting Trump out of office.
Right. Yeah, I agree. No, that's one thing that I said all throughout the Mueller ordeal, which is that when there is something legitimate that comes up on Trump, you're going to have a much harder time persuading the public that it's actionable or that it's legitimate, given these mounting failures that for some reason you are utterly resistant to acknowledging or to modifying your behavior in light of. So, that I think is now, we're now seeing the fruit born of that. And, whether and the point you make about partisan tribalism or what the impact of impeachment will be, I think is an important one, because I don't think that divisiveness or division is inherently bad. It's just sort of inherent to politics, right? Because it's how you distribute power in society, at least in the public domain. So I'm not against that for all purposes, but I think you want to be careful about the polls around which you orient your division, right? So if there's a spectrum of division, you want it to be the most fruitful possible spectrum, rather than one that's kind of centered around maybe petty tribal differences, identity differences, culture war differences. I think that does not lead to any kind of fruitful politics for the most part. So I try to discourage that when I see it. I mean, it's a little bit abstract in terms of when exactly you can identify something as being oriented around those polls, but you kind of know when you see it, to use the cliched Supreme Court phrase. And I think this is another example of that, because you're going to have partisan tension inflamed around procedural issues that don't unto themselves necessarily have any political content, right? So whether a certain committee gets an article of impeachment referred to it, or how long they have it, or the kind of stuff that's a little bit arcane, that is inevitable as a result of the impeachment process being initiated, it's going to take on this partisan flavor that I don't think is constructive, because it's going to make people become tribal around issues that at core are not really worth rallying around.
I mean, division is part of political life, but by polarization, I generally mean an intensity of division that's so great that it does what you're warning against, which it just renders people incapable of seeing clearly. It's like during Russiagate, like basically at no point do you hear many people on the left who are sounding increasingly like cold warriors from the 1950s say, wait a second, wasn't traditionally the position of the left to be skeptical of, rampant hawkish caricature of our Cold War adversaries like Russia and China? It's just that you slowly, your policy positions become increasingly subordinate to this war with a political war with a specific group of people. Yeah, and the same thing happens on the right, on the other side.
Sure, and now I continue to worry about the hawkish premises embedded in the current argument for impeachment. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi going before the nation last week and saying Trump betrayed the country. I don't know how well that's going to be interpreted among the tribal.
I think he betrayed his duties. I do think I agree. I don't like betrayed the country, because it does almost necessarily put it in a policy specific context. Like,
right,
the Russians are the enemies and we didn't send arms to the Ukrainians. I think that's totally the wrong way to look at it.
Right, and you basically have the many Democrats who came around to impeachment in the last week saying that they did it on the basis of national security. So they're framing the entire issue around national security and Trump jeopardizing national security. I don't know what national security was necessarily jeopardized, even if you have the most uncharitable possible interpretation of what Trump did, which maybe I would agree with at least in part. The idea that it jeopardized national security, I think, is a little dubious. And also it gives rise to a whole rhetoric that's going to consume this, which I think probably is going to militate toward a more aggressive and antagonistic posture in the realm of national security. So that's sort of the rhetoric that's now being adopted. Kamala Harris, I saw, was on MSNBC last week and said Trump is the least patriotic president of all time. I just don't think that's territory on which Democrats would probably be best served in kind of like staking their claims to the anti-Trump argument. Mm-hmm. I just think that, I don't know who anybody is going to – I can't imagine a single American citizen who's going to be sitting there watching Kamala Harris or Adam Schiff on MSNBC inveighing against Trump's lack of patriotism and saying, you know what, they're right. Maybe they're more patriotic than Trump, and I'll support them on that basis. I just think we're now going to there's going to be a lot of dubious rhetoric that's going to have within it hidden implications that probably bolster a more militaristic and national security obsessed conception of American politics. And if you want to remove Trump, you got to do it prudently, and removing Trump, or at least impeaching him, could also have secondary ill effects. And I think that could very feasibly be one of them.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned removing Trump. I mean, the final thing, another thing I worried about in this issue of the Non-Zero newsletter, not to plug.
I believe I'm subscribed to that. Or I'm subscribed. I believe I'm subscribed to that. Or I'm
well, if you were subscribed to the Mindful Resistance newsletter, that was its previous title, and you would be getting, and your email you would be getting it. I mean, Mindful Resistance refers to a lot of what we've been talking about. Is like, I'm all for resisting Trump, but go about it mindfully, smartly. But anyway, the other thing I worried about is I actually don't think it's impossible. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible that impeachment leads to Trump's removal, because if so much damaging stuff comes out, and it would take a lot, but if so much comes out that it looks like he just can't possibly win re-election, I can imagine a mutiny of 20 senators, Republican senators who aren't up for immediate re-election or something, because they're like, no, I'd rather put Mike Pence in and throw the dice and hope he can win. And what I want to warn you about is Mike Pence can win. And anybody who thinks he cannot be elected if he is put in office to replace Trump is, I think, seriously confused, in part because, to be honest, the array of Democratic candidates, although they have many merits, and I'd be happy to have many of them as president, they are largely not all that well suited to actually winning an election. They all have downside. They mostly have significant downsides.
Right. And let's say, hypothetically, that Trump were removed through some accident of fortune or whatever, where you get 20 Republican senators to go along with the mutiny. It seems unlikely, but I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, who knows? I think then, and because again, this is a political process, so we're not talking strictly about law here. We're talking about the broader issues that are going to be at play in terms of the political calculus. I think that if Trump were removed in a way that is at least perceived to be sort of extra legally, even though impeachment is obviously constitutional, so it's not illegal, but at least removed in this spectacular and unprecedented way by which no other president has been removed. Mm-hmm. So others have been impeached, but not removed. What is that going to do in terms of Trumpism broadly construed? I think if you want to tamp down on the more noxious elements of Trumpism, you probably want to repudiate it electorally, mm-hmm. rather than, in a way, vindicate their victimhood narrative, or at least give them some reason why they might perceive that they're being kind of stamped out in this mm-hmm. way that is without precedent, and which it would be. So that's, I think, got to be borne in mind as we proceed here, because again, if it's a political process, which people again have been repeating over and over as a matter of cliche, then I'm going to insist on incorporating a bevy of political considerations because, again, it's not as though we're just going to court here. We're doing a nationwide referendum, so to say, that is going to have to, I think, take into account a multitude of factors.
Yeah. No, again, I am far from sure impeachment is going to work out well from the point of view of people like me who oppose Trump. The ideal outcome for my money is it does damage him. Enough new material comes out that it does damage him enough that he does lose the election, but not that he gets removed from office. But in any event, we're going to pay the price you allude to, which is that the polarization is going to get worse. Impeachment is just almost necessarily going to further embitter a lot of Trump supporters, and I'm very much concerned about that. I don't see how you avoid that.
And it will embitter, partisan Democrats in a way as well, probably, which could help to kind of actualize them electorally. So when there was the initial flare-up of talk around impeachment a couple months ago, I wrote a column also for the New York Daily News about why, even though I disagreed with impeachment on the substance, I could imagine a scenario where it actually was disadvantageous to Trump electorally, because if Trump were impeached and then acquitted by the Senate, you might have a lot of Democrats saying to themselves, okay, now we are even more excited to remove Trump from office because it's the only vehicle left to actually get him out of power. And we want to punish the Republicans in the Senate who we feel acquitted him on false grounds. So, I could see that actually weighing against Trump potentially. There's a whole variety of potential scenarios, but if that possible scenario were to come to pass, it would inflame and embitter partisan tensions on the Democratic side as well in a way that I don't think is going to be necessarily constructive, again, given the inclination toward the adoption of hidden hawkish premises that we've seen arise in a variety of ways over the past couple years. And, the way in which they, it's just going to be very ugly across the board. And that, I think, is unfortunate, because there was an opening here in the era of Trump to actually potentially forge a new way of orienting politics. And if it all just gets subsumed into this binary choice between impeach or don't impeach, then I think whether that's going to become less permissible. So like new modes of politics are going to be less and less attainable. And I think that would be a very unfortunate outcome. I'm curious to see how this would affect somebody like Bernie Sanders, for whom I don't think impeachment and all the attendant issues around it is necessarily in his political wheelhouse. So I don't know that he stands to benefit much from a political climate.
That when you say it's not in his political wheelhouse?
Well, I don't think that he's somebody who by nature would be inclined to devote a lot of time and energy to parsing out the issues involved in impeachment in a legal way. We know what articles of impeachment are going to be drafted, what statutes were violated, that kind of thing. It's just not.
No, he's an issues guy. He doesn't really like to spend a lot of time on politics per se.
Right. So, given how inherently political this process is going to be, I am leery of that in the sense that I think doesn't stand to benefit him very much. And I think he, at least on the Democratic side, in terms of the candidates who are perceived as viable, probably represents the newest mode of politics that could become mainstream or central to American discourse in the Trump era. And if now this impeachment saga consuming everything precludes that I think would be a harmful side effect.
Yeah, I think it's quite unpredictable how this is going to play out. I have a bad feeling about it, but I think more facts will come out, for one thing, that are hard to predict. And then I think I've rarely seen a thing that was about to happen politically that I was less sure about in terms of how it would play out.
Yeah, anybody who tells you they're sure about how it's going to play out, whether they're pro-Trump, anti-Trump, whatever, they're out of their minds, because we have no good historical precedent for this. I don't want to hear about 1998 anymore, because it's just an entirely different set of circumstances and really has no relevance here.
That was a different world.
I think it's best to maintain some humility about future events. That should be pretty obvious now from all we've experienced lately. And we'll have to see how it goes. But I'm with you. I don't feel particularly optimistic about it.
Okay, well, we'll end on a note of humility for you. I think that's a good look for you.
Yeah, my admirers online don't tend to associate humility with me. So
I was going to say maybe you should try it more often, but it's up to you. Far be it from me to advise you until at least you reach the age when you can run for president. And
at what point you can become a formal advisor for me. You can actually lead my vice presidential selection committee, and then at the last minute, select yourself as vice president, and we can do a whole 2000 thing.
Or just become a consultant for Ukrainian oil company or something. Once you're in office, I could do that.
$50K a year is not bad. You should look into that.
That was a month.
A month. You're right.
$50K a year isn't bad. A month is really good.
No, a month. Exactly. So if you want to be the beneficiary of obvious graft, I will take you on as a close and treasured
partner. It's a
deal.
We may want to edit this out. So tell people where they can find you.
Yeah. So Twitter, obviously,
which is what? M Tracey with an E.
M Tracey with an E.
Tracey.
Correct. I have a Patreon where I post a podcast roughly once a week. I post additional material on YouTube, all of which you can find through my Twitter, or you could just Google, M Tracey YouTube or podcasts or whatever, it'll come up. I write usually one column a week for the Spectator magazine. So you could seek that out. I'm now writing for Real Clear Politics, which is one piece that I sent you recently on this. And I also
will link
for
to
a variety of other publications. Yeah, I actually sent it to you over. I DM'd it to you. So if you, I don't know if you saw that. Oh, you said you'll link to that. Okay,
we will link to it on the site on the Bloggingheads TV site. This will appear both in YouTube and on the site, but it'll be on the site.
Okay, got it. And then I write for different places in addition. So that'll, if you follow me, you will no doubt come across that too, and you will be I hope edified by it and pleasured by it.
And if you're going to get all self-promotional, Michael, I think I will. On Twitter, I'm at Robert Reiter, WRIGHTER. We do put out the aforementioned non-zero newsletter. We have a Patreon that supports all of our stuff, including this very conversation. And if you Google Patreon and me, for example, or non-zero, you'll probably get there. Or even Mindful Resistance, which I think is still the URL of the Patreon, although now it supports a broader range of activities. So thank you. Thank you, Michael. What's that?
I said I believe I am a patron of
Are you a patron?
There. Yeah. So
are you trying to pressure me into becoming a patron of yours?
You can go do an audit. No, I actually am a patron because I like to spread the love. So
okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to release military aid to you,
okay,
which had been bottled up for reasons I totally don't understand.
No, that's truly a corrupt deal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. Keep it up.
All right. Thanks, Bob.
See ya.